On a quiet autumn afternoon in the town of Rosefield, 76-year-old Evelyn Monroe, a black woman, sat silently on the porch of her old wooden house where she had lived for more than half a century. But that peace was shattered by a 911 call from her white neighbor, Tracy Whitmore, who claimed Evelyn was suspicious simply for sitting in silence. Moments later, 2 police officers arrived, approaching with cold, steady steps. "Stand up. Put your hands behind your back. You are under investigation," said Officer Rick Halston, his hand resting near his holstered weapon. "This is my home," Evelyn replied calmly. "If you don't cooperate, we'll handcuff you right here." Just seconds more, and the elderly woman could have been taken away like a criminal, if not for the timely arrival of a man stepping out of a black SUV in full uniform. Her son, Ryan Monroe. What happened next? Silenced the entire town. And this story, once again, shows that prejudice can start with a look, but will end with undeniable truth. Don't look away. Make sure to subscribe and tell us where you're watching and what time it is. Drop it in the comments below, because you can't miss the story of the woman who stood her ground to change the world. They say time moves slowly in small towns. But in Rosefield, Georgia, time doesn't just slow down. Things don't just happen here. They seep into each other until something happens. At the end of Maple Street, there's an old-fashioned house. The paint is peeling in patches, and the flower pots on the porch are tilted by the first rain of the season. But if you walk by, you'll see one thing that hasn't changed. A black woman with white hair, sitting quietly on a rickety wooden chair. It's Evelyn Monroe, 72. She doesn't speak. She doesn't wave. She doesn't carry a book or a phone. She just sits. Upright. Her eyes followed the fading light through the maple trees in front of the house. Nothing special, right? But look again. That afternoon, Evelyn was sipping her tea when Tracy Whitmore emerged from the house across the street. She was 42, with blonde hair pulled back, heavy makeup, and a piercing gaze. Her cream poodle tugged at her leash, but Tracy didn't stop. She turned to look at Evelyn. Her eyes were like she was counting out an old item in a storage room, and then quickened her pace, gripping the leash tighter. Evelyn didn't react, not a wince, not a glance back, but inside her, another old scratch had been scratched open. She knew she was being watched, judged, and judged by people who had never asked her a question. She wasn't a neighbor anymore. She was an old colored person sitting on the porch, not knowing what to do. But Evelyn didn't leave. Little did she know that in a few minutes, that peaceful life would be torn apart by a phone call. An unnecessary call, a false alarm, a seemingly small decision, but enough to ignite a fire, and that fire would burn down the illusion of safety of the entire neighborhood. But at that moment, Mrs. Evelyn sat still, unflinching, not hiding, alone, amidst invisible suspicions. She didn't need to do anything. Just sitting there was enough to change the world around her. Some storms don't come with thunder. They come with a phone call. "Hello, 911. I'd like to report a suspicious situation. There's an elderly woman. She's sitting on her front porch, staring out the windows. She doesn't seem right. I'm afraid she might be confused or up to no good." Tracy's voice was steady, practiced almost. Not a trace of trepidation, but nervous enough that the emergency system wouldn't miss it. On the other end of the line, the operator took notes, like a machine. "The subject is an elderly woman, black, sitting quietly, correct?" Tracy glanced out the window. Evelyn was still sitting, not moving, not looking at anyone, just as quiet as ever. But to Tracy, that silence was a threat. "Yes, I think she's watching the area. Could be agitated." She hung up after less than 2 minutes and walked away, as if she had just finished her neighborhood watch duty. On the other side of the street, Evelyn was still oblivious. The tea in her hand had gone cold, but she didn't care. She was thinking about her son, Ryan Monroe, who was working in the Capitol. He had called less often lately. But she didn't blame him. She understood that his job was a stressful one. endure, silence. The first sound wasn't a car horn. It was the soft screech of tires on the cobblestones. Then the sound of a police car engine. Not in a hurry, not blaring, but still drawing the attention of the whole street. The black and white patrol car slid in like a nocturnal predator. Thick glass doors, white license plate. The radio was still blaring on the intercom. Two police of, "Ma'am, we've just received a call about suspicious activity in this area," Hank began, his voice flat as if reading a report. "We were told there's an older woman sitting near the porch who appears to be watching or behaving erratically." Evelyn didn't answer right away. She just looked at them, not with panic, not with condescension, but with the look of someone who had lived long enough to know what was real, what was dangerous, and what was inevitable. "I live here," she said, her voice as deep and steady as the old stone floor. "This is my house. And I sit here every day, at this hour." Lynn Carter, the young cop, paused. He looked around. The peaceful house, the potted flowers, the coffee table, the shawl on her lap. Nothing suspicious. Nothing. But Hank didn't stop. "Can you tell me what you've been doing for the last hour?" Evelyn sighed. "I made tea. I read poetry. I sat." "Have you left the porch?" "I haven't. My back hurts. And I don't need to go anywhere." The air began to thicken. Evelyn knew, from the moment the car rolled onto the street, that her silence was about to be questioned. And this time it wasn't just words. On the other side of the street, windows were sliding shut. But phones were starting to peek out. Some were recording videos. They knew something was happening. And they knew, if they didn't record it, it might not be the same tomorrow. Evelyn looked at the two men in front of her. She remembered the first time she'd protested in 1968, when police on horseback chased people away like weeds. She remembered the time she'd been turned away from a rental in Richmond because the neighborhood wasn't right. She remembered the look on the faces of blonde women like Tracy as she walked into the grocery store. Curiosity mixed with fear, but masked by polite smiles. And today she saw that look again, but this time accompanied by a badge, a gun, and a force called procedure. "Ma'am, if you cannot provide concrete evidence that you have not left this position within the past hour, we will be forced to bring you back to headquarters for verification." Evelyn smiled faintly, a smile that was not amused, not ironic, just a smile that had lost all hope of plausibility. "I'm 72. I don't have a camera. I have a cold cup of tea and arthritic feet. And if that's enough to make you doubt me..." She raised her head and looked Hank straight in the eye. "Then you didn't come here to ask. You came to arrest." There are moments in life that seem small, but are the first cracks that bring down a system. And for Evelyn Monroe, a 72-year-old woman sitting on her porch, that moment began when the uniformed man reached for the handcuffs. The wooden chair Evelyn sat on didn't budge. Her hands rested on the armrests, her fingers trembling slightly. Not from fear, but from a wearying familiarity with this situation. How many times in her life had she been looked at as if she were a problem? How many times had the silent presence of a woman of color been interpreted as a threat? And today it happened again, on her own porch. Rick Halston, the officer with the cold, stone-walled gaze, stood just a few feet away from Evelyn. His right hand rested loosely on his gun. His left hand had pulled out a pair of metal handcuffs, glinting in the afternoon light like a silent threat. "I'll say it one last time," Halston said, his voice cold and harsh. "You refuse to cooperate. We're going to have to take you to the station." Evelyn didn't answer right away. She just turned, her gaze slowly meeting his. Not fear, not pleading, but tenacity. "If you want to handcuff a 72-year-old woman for sitting on her porch, then go ahead. But I won't stand up, and I won't follow." Daniel Voss, the younger officer, standing behind him, stepped forward, about to intervene. But Halston's gaze stopped him. Daniel looked at Evelyn. The teacup was cold, but she was still holding it. Her thin arms trembled slightly. He had the feeling he was standing before a living witness, not to an incident, but to an entire forgotten era. But Halston didn't see it. He took a step forward. And that step, just one step, was enough to make the neighbors crack open their windows. A few phones were raised, furtive recordings. Eyes peered from behind curtains, curious, wary, and a little guilty. "You're obstructing a law enforcement officer," Halston repeated. "And you," Evelyn replied, "are insulting a human being." On the deserted street, the air was thick. No birds, no cars. Just the click of the handcuffs in Halston's hands. A countdown to a mistake that was about to go down in Maple Street's history. And then an engine roared. Not a siren, but a deep, steady rumble of a black military SUV gliding into the neighborhood like a ghost summoned at the right moment. The car screeched to a halt in front of Evelyn's house. The door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, straight-shouldered, his navy uniform neatly pressed. His eyes were cold but bright. No introduction, no badge, just the way he walked. People knew he was someone unusual. Rick Halston immediately withdrew his hand from the gun. Daniel Voss swallowed. That man, Ryan Monroe, Evelyn's son, and also the senior commander of the National Security Agency, a man whose name alone would make many policemen stand at attention. He did not hurry. He did not push. But every step he took made everything seem to slow down, as if time itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. He stopped at the foot of the steps. His eyes swept over every detail. The chair where his mother sat, her clenched hands, the glint of handcuffs in the hands of the police. He did not ask, did not need to ask. It was all too clear. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice low but sharp as a scalpel. Halston straightened his back, speaking as usual. "This is a civil intervention. A woman has been reported for suspicious behavior," Ryan interrupted. "No shouting, no banging on the table, just no more lying aloud." He pulled out a small leather wallet. He held it high, clear, insignia, badge. State emblem, Commander Ryan Monroe, National Security Agency. Daniel Voss took a half step back. Halston frowned, but his hands were already out of the handcuffs. Offensive turned to defensive in a flash. "Evelyn Monroe," Ryan said, "is my mother. Legal resident, owner of this house for over 40 years. And by federal law, any enforcement action against a non-violent citizen must be supported by evidence." Halston pursed his lips, not as firm as before. "We were just following protocol. Procedure does not include putting your hand on a weapon in front of a 72-year-old woman drinking tea," Ryan said firmly. A tense silence. Evelyn still said nothing, but her eyes softened. Not because she needed to be rescued, but because she knew that her son had just brought to light a truth that the entire town had tried to ignore, that the presence of a woman of color just sitting still caused the system to react as if a gun had been fired. And today, the system had picked up on the wrong person. The first phone went live. A teenager filming the video whispered, "Oh my God, his mother was targeted. And he was the head of national security. He was dead. He was going to die." All around the neighborhood, lights were starting to come on in the windows. People were no longer hiding, because this was no longer a secret. Halston sighed. Daniel Voss, slowly, stepped back, as if to pull himself out of the impending vortex. "And Ryan?" He stepped up the steps, without turning. He bent down, gently placed his hand on his mother's shoulder. "Are you okay?" Evelyn looked at him, eyes glistening, but no tears. "Since you showed up, things have been okay." Ryan Monroe was still standing there, between his mother and two police officers who still didn't understand that they had entered a completely different battlefield. This was no longer a woman being falsely accused. This was a red line between civil rights and abuse of power. He turned to Halston, who still had the handcuffs dangling in his hand. "I want to know, who called?" Ryan asked, his voice even. Halston glanced at Daniel. "A resident, Tracy Whitmore, said Evelyn was behaving suspiciously, looking in another house's window," Ryan repeated slowly. "Suspicious behavior, sitting drinking tea." On the porch, no one answered. But there was no need. Neighbors began to quietly move out of their doors. An old man with a cane stood at the end of the alley. A woman pushed a stroller. A young woman, filming and live streaming, whispered to the hundreds of people watching. The security chief's mother was about to be arrested, and he just appeared like in a movie. The air was frozen. No one spoke. But that silence was the first trial. Ryan didn't need to shout. He just took a step forward, facing Halston. You were going to handcuff a 72-year-old woman, no weapon, no threat, just because someone didn't like the sight of her? Halston began to waver. I was just doing my duty. Ryan didn't back down. Responsibility isn't about being a tool for prejudice. Responsibility is about distinguishing between risk and deception. And today, you chose wrong. Daniel Voss spoke now, his voice hesitant. We didn't know she was your mother. If we had known, things would have been different. Ryan turned to him, slowly. So if she's not my mother, what are you going to do? Drag her off the porch? Take her through the crowd filming? Let her be the uncooperative elderly suspect tomorrow morning? Is that justice? Daniel was silent, looking down. A child ran across the yard, tugging at his mother's hand. Mommy, is that woman arrested? His mother bent down, shook her head, whispered, No. She lived here before the whole place was paved. Evelyn still said nothing, but now she was no longer alone. The eyes were on her, no longer suspicious. Shame, awareness, confusion, because they knew, even though they didn't call the police. They had been silent for years whenever Evelyn was ignored, looked at with strange eyes. And today they couldn't be silent anymore. Ryan took out his phone, dipped quickly. I want to report to the command immediately. Officers Halston and Voss, code numbers 4097 and 42122. The incident is being recorded live. There are many witnesses. I request that these two individuals be suspended pending investigation. Halston exclaimed, Wait! Ryan didn't listen, didn't need to listen. This is no longer just between you and your mother. This is a message to the entire system, that you can't touch an innocent person and hope it will be forgotten. That every eye, every camera, every story from today on will mention your name. Evelyn then spoke, softly, but loud enough for the whole yard to hear. I don't need anyone to protect me. I just need people to stop treating me like a stranger. I lived here when these trees were first planted, when there were no streetlights. I used to sweep snow off the sidewalks for entire blocks, and now I'm the one who's being suspected for just sitting there? A woman approached from a distance, whispering, I'm sorry, I never said hello to you. Evelyn smiled slightly. Not yet. The crowd began to applaud. Not loudly, but sporadically, and then more thickly and warmly. Not in triumph, but because they saw themselves in Evelyn's silence. A person who had been present, who had laughed, who had cared for this corner, was now being treated as a threat because they had forgotten her. And now she reminded them. With silence, with dignity, not with anger. Halston bowed his head and drew his cuffs into his belt. Daniel said nothing, but left the steps. Ryan turned to his mother. Mom, I'm sorry I didn't get here sooner. Evelyn looked at him, her eyes filled with something that thousands of people watching the live stream could feel, but couldn't name. No, I came just in time. And not just for you. For all the other moms sitting on their porches ignored by the world. The next morning, the sun rose on Maple Street, but the light seemed brighter than usual, into the shadows that no one had ever wanted to see before. Evelyn Monroe sat on her porch, as she always did. A cup of tea in her hand, her eyes fixed on the end of the street, where everything had happened the night before. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence was now a language the entire neighborhood had to learn. Ryan Monroe wasn't silent. He'd been up early, making calls, writing reports, preparing documents. And now he stood before City Hall, with more than 30 residents, 5 reporters, a local TV crew, and a story that no one could hide anymore. Facing him was Sheriff Emmett Green, a man with silver hair and eyes that had once been considered trustworthy. Today, his eyes were strained. We've looked into it, Emmett told the crowd. And I believe it was all a misunderstanding, an overreaction on both sides. Ryan interrupted, not loudly, but his words were heavy as lead. I stand here, not as a national security officer, but as a son and as a citizen of this town. He held up a small USB drive, plugging it into the screen. On it, images from neighborhood cameras and phone live streams played. Evelyn sat still. Halston touched his gun. Voss fumbled. Then Ryan appeared. The crowd fell silent. This is not a misunderstanding. This is a clear example of conditioned response, the response of a system that has grown accustomed to suspecting first, investigating later. He turned to the sheriff. If I hadn't gotten there, my mother would have been handcuffed, on the steps of her own house, where she had fed the poor, given blood, and been a fixture at this town's community festival. A woman in the crowd nodded, her eyes welling with tears. And why? Ryan asked loudly. A call from a neighbor. No evidence, no approach, no verification. We'll do an internal investigation, Emmett interrupted. Ryan didn't back down. So I ask, how many cases like this have been internally investigated and never brought up again? No answer. How many other Evelyns, who didn't have sons who were officers, have been taken away? No cameras, no witnesses, no voice, no answer. At the back of the room, a trembling hand went up. Tracy Whitmore, the person who called 911. The room turned. A shockwave of silence spread. Tracy stepped forward, hair in a bun, no lipstick, a crumpled piece of paper in her hand. I didn't know it would go this far, she began, her voice cracking. Ryan looked at her. Not contemptuously, not angrily, but not retreating. What did you think would happen if you called the police and said there was a suspicious person on your porch? Tracy bowed her head. I just thought she wasn't like the rest of them. She didn't show up to neighborhood meetings, didn't answer when I waved. A man in the crowd whispered, "And that's enough to call the police." Tracy wiped away tears. I was scared. But now I know. That fear didn't come from Evelyn. It came from prejudices I never realized I had. She turned to Evelyn, choking back tears. I'm sorry. Evelyn was still sitting in the front row. She stood slowly. All eyes followed her as she made her way to the podium. She had no paper. She didn't need any. She had the experience of a lifetime. I'm not angry with you, Evelyn said. I was scared like you. Scared of being kicked out of the building when I first moved in. Scared that my son would be looked at differently just because he was darker than the other kids in his class. But I learned to live, not by running away from fear, but by sitting still and showing people, I'm here, I'm still here. My presence, it's not a threat, it's existence, and existence doesn't need permission. The audience erupted in applause, not because they were cheering for an old woman, but because they were applauding for their own conscience, just waking up. Ryan stepped forward, standing next to his mother. If this is the beginning, he said, let it be the beginning of truth, not a belated apology. The chief stepped to the microphone. His face was no longer defensive. We're changing. We're suspending the 2 officers involved, reopening all patrol records for the past 6 months, and inviting an independent watchdog to investigate. A reporter jotted down each word. And I'm going to personally apologize to Evelyn Monroe, in front of the whole town. He turned to her, bowing. For the first time, Evelyn smiled. Ryan Monroe straightened, his eyes scanning the room, where all eyes were no longer on Sheriff Emmett Green, but on the slow-moving but dignified old woman, Evelyn Monroe. Evelyn didn't say much, but each step she took to the podium was like hammering another nail into the silence that had kept the neighborhood locked in false politeness for so long. I'm not a symbol, she said, her voice small but powerful. I'm just a mother, a grandmother, a resident. But if sitting on your porch is going to get people to call the police, then maybe we need to rethink who we are. There was a sob from the back row. A young woman, blonde, red-faced, couldn't hold back her tears. It was Julie Hamlin, who lived next door to Evelyn, had nodded to her 3 times in 5 years, but had never invited her in once. Julie stood up, her hands shaking. I'm sorry. Not because I called the police, I didn't. But I didn't do anything. When I saw them coming up to your porch last night, I just closed the window, and I thought, I did the right thing. Now I know. Silence is complicity. The hall fell silent. A middle-aged man's voice rang out from behind him. We're all to blame. Ryan clenched his hands into fists, not out of anger, but because he was holding something deep in his chest, a mix of pain and hope. pain, because his mother had lived in a neighborhood where most of her neighbors hadn't really seen her. Hope, because finally they were starting to see her. He turned to Tracy Whitmore, the woman who had called 911. She was still standing there, frozen as a statue. But this time, her eyes were different, no longer scared, naked. She faced her own mistake, without defense, without excuses. "I don't expect Evelyn to forgive me right away," Tracy said. "But I promise, I won't turn away again." Evelyn looked at her, not speaking. But her small nod softened the mood in the room, not because anyone was forgiven, but because the courage to admit mistakes is always the beginning of change. Chief Emmett Green stepped back to the microphone. His face was no longer that of a man in office, but that of a father, a neighbor, a man trying to save something fragile. "I can't undo what happened, but I can promise, from this day forward, the police department will operate under a different standard. We're bringing in a civilian oversight agency. We're going to investigate the policing of seniors, people of color, and I'll personally apologize to Evelyn Monroe." He turned to her. "I'm sorry this happened, and please help us change." Evelyn said nothing. She just looked at him, long, deep, as if considering something bigger than an apology. Then she turned to the crowd. "Want to change? Let's start by knowing each other's names. Let's start by saying hello when we pass each other. Let's start by looking at each other and seeing people, not threats." A round of applause broke out, not unanimous, but no one objected. Ryan stepped down from the podium and stood next to his mother. "I'm proud of you," he said softly. She looked at him, took his hand. "Don't be proud. Keep going. Because if you don't keep going, this applause will be a passing wind." Ryan nodded. He knew she was right. And so, that day, in front of the whole town, a 72-year-old black woman didn't need to shout, didn't need to hold a banner, didn't need to take to the streets, but still shook the whole system just by not standing up when threatened and not leaving her own porch. One gray Wednesday morning, Ryan Monroe opened his car door and walked into the Meadowville Police Department's main office. He'd done it hundreds of times in his career. But today, the mood was different. No question. He walked down a long hallway lined with familiar faces, but unfamiliar eyes. Each look was half salute, half wary. A few turned away as he approached. People who had patted him on the back, shared coffee and family stories, now clutched files as if he could make them explode with his mere presence. No one said it out loud, but Ryan knew what was brewing. To some on the force, he was no longer Captain Monroe. He was a disruptor of the hidden order, someone who dared to do what no one else did, publicly expose the wrongdoings at the heart of the system he was a part of. On his desk, a thick file was held together with a rubber band. Each page was an unexcused stop, a strange note, a complaint that had been forgotten. He opened the first page. Stopped. Mr. Sylvester Hayes, 82, walking home from church. Reason: unusual behavior. Unusual? An old man walking on the sidewalk with a cane? Ryan clenched his jaw. How long have they been using excuses like that? He wondered aloud. Since people like you never ask questions, a voice replied behind him. It was Lieutenant Garza. I've seen that report. I used to ignore it, Garza admitted. It was easier, safer. But when you stood up, Ryan, you made me look again. He said nothing. But their eyes met, and something quiet, profound, happened. Someone in the shadows stepped into the light. Meanwhile, in the neighborhood, Evelyn Monroe sat in her living room, where her dining table had become a miniature post office, a handwritten letter from California, a printed email from a college student in Boston, a box of chocolates with the words, "You made me believe that the porch could be the strongest place in the world." Evelyn didn't know how to respond, but she didn't need the spotlight. She just needed silence and respect. When there was a soft knock on the door, she was surprised. On the porch stood a young white woman in her late 40s, holding a lemon cake and an uncertain look in her eyes. "I'm Holly. Corner house." The woman spoke quickly, as if afraid that if she was slow, she would change her mind. "I've lived here 7 years. Never talked to you. I just wanted to say, I admire you, and I'm sorry I'm so late." Evelyn smiled, slightly, but not faintly. "I'm not late. I'm right on time, when my heart is ready." Holly smiled sheepishly, then sat down on the porch steps. The two of them sat there, one an unintentional monument, the other a witness who had just awakened. And the magic was, they sat there like equals, no one preaching, no one lecturing. That evening, Ryan was called into a closed-door meeting. It was just him, the city police chief, and a representative from the State Security Council. "We hear what you do," the representative said, his hands on the table as if preparing to negotiate. "And a lot of places don't like it." Ryan crossed his arms. "I don't do it because they like it. No. But when you make too much noise, you become a target." "I don't make noise. I just don't cover my ears." There was a pause. The representative sighed. "If you continue down this path, your career will not be smooth. Do you understand?" Ryan looked at him straight in the eye. "If I wanted to be smooth, I would have kept quiet when my mother was suspected of a crime for sitting still." The police chief, who had been silent the entire time, looked up. "Monroe, I don't agree with everything you've done, but I won't stop you, as long as you're willing to face the consequences." Ryan nodded. His eyes held not desperation, but a quiet conviction that if the truth had to be paid, it would be a much cheaper price than the price of continued silence. Meadowville held a flea market on the weekend. The people who had once dismissed Evelyn as a shadow now invited her to try some of their cakes, and invited her to sit in the front row. A little girl ran up to hug her, whispering, "You're the bravest person I've ever seen." Evelyn stroked her hair, whispering, "No, dear. I'm just not afraid to look the truth in the face, and you shouldn't be either." And at the end of this day, as people began to clear out, Ryan stood behind his mother, his arm around her shoulders. He knew. Things were still rough. Investigations were ongoing. Public opinion was still polarized. But in that moment, he saw her as a soldier sees his idol. Strong, humble, and unyielding. It all started with a small piece of paper, sticky between the magazines Evelyn kept in her mailbox. No return address, just shaky handwriting. "I was once asked to get out of a car in front of my house, just because I was wearing pajamas and a headscarf. On this same street in 2017. No one believed me. I saw you. And I knew I'm not crazy." Evelyn read, her hands shaking a little. Not because she was afraid, but because she saw herself in it. That afternoon, when the sunlight was still touching the porch, Evelyn put a second chair next to her old rocking chair. She didn't call anyone, didn't invite anyone. She just left it empty. And an hour later, someone sat in it. Marcus Hill, the retired butcher. He didn't say anything for the first 10 minutes, just sat. Then he spoke, hoarse and slow. "In 2002, I was taken into a police car for waiting for my niece outside the school gates. They said I was moving erratically. I told the principal. She told me to have mercy on them because these days it's dangerous." Marcus laughed bitterly. "I just thought dangerous is me, an old man in a crisp shirt." Evelyn put her hand on his, said nothing. He nodded, as if he had waited his whole life for someone to listen without suspecting him. The next day, a third chair appeared, then a fourth, and every afternoon, on Evelyn's porch, someone stopped by, not to speak, but to let out what had been bottled up for too long. A young woman named Jasmine said she was once asked by police to open the trunk of her car while driving home from night school, because it was an old car with a new license plate. A 17-year-old boy, sitting on the steps, confessed that he was afraid to wear a hoodie outside. Not because of the weather, but because they looked at me differently. A middle-aged couple whispered to Evelyn, "Our daughter has an Asian last name. She had her bag searched 3 times in 1 month. We thought it was a small thing. But then we saw you. We knew it was a sign." Ryan began to notice something strange. Every time he came home, he would see a few people standing outside the gate. No bustle, no noise. They stood there like pilgrims, not there to look, but to remember something inside themselves. He didn't understand it all right away. until he stepped onto the porch and saw someone he never expected to see sitting there. Tracy Whitmore, the girl who had called 911 the night of the porch storm. Tracy sat there, eyes red, hands clasped together like a schoolgirl. "I thought just saying sorry would do it," she said, not looking at anyone. But it didn't. "I saw people coming in here telling stories about how they had been treated unfairly, and I realized I too had turned a blind eye to the times when my friends had been scrutinized more harshly, spoken to more harshly. I called it social order. But it was unfair, I knew. I was the one who created it." Evelyn didn't blame, she just listened. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Tracy whispered. "I just want to know how to start over." Evelyn put a hand on Tracy's lap. "I started. When I sat down and stopped telling myself lies, I started." For 2 weeks, Evelyn Monroe's porch was no longer a place for her to sit and rest. It became a repository of community memories. There were no microphones, no live streams, no slogans. But there, people saw each other. Not through prejudice, not through car windows, not through doors locked in fear. People saw each other and remembered. How long had it been since we dared to tell the things that made our hearts tremble? On Saturday night, Ryan placed a small wooden board next to the porch steps. On it were engraved the simple words, "A place to share, no judgment." And underneath were 3 smaller lines. "Have you ever been misunderstood? Have you witnessed injustice and couldn't speak up? Have you ever been silent for fear of being seen differently? Sit down. Evelyn will listen." That night, Ryan did not sleep. He stood by the window, watching the pale light of the street lamps cast shadows on the lawn. In his mind, events rushed like gusts of wind against the glass. Cold stares at the office, stalking messages, articles that turned the story from son protecting mother to officer causing internal division. The closer he got to the truth, the more isolated he felt. His phone had more than 70 unread messages. Half were supportive. The other half were threatening, or more dangerously, vague, suggestive sentences, as if someone was watching his every move. "See your car parked in front of your house every night. Don't leave it there forever. Beautiful. Model family. Hope to keep that image for a long time. If you want to go far, sometimes you have to leave something behind." The words didn't need to be specific to make people's skin cold. The next morning, Ryan met with a former officer named Jared Hollins, who had retired early because he had opposed the use of pressure tactics in poor neighborhoods. Hollins sat in a coffee shop next to the station and handed Ryan a small envelope. "I've had this for a long time, but now you probably need it more than I do." Inside were internal copies of buried civilian complaints, including at least 3 involving Officer Voss, the man who had tried to arrest Evelyn, over the past 5 years. "Has anyone ever worked on these cases?" Ryan asked. "No. He was a friend of his. The original report was lost. Then it died." Ryan sighed, his hand resting on the file like a relic. "And now that I've brought them to light, they say I betrayed the department." "Ryan," Holland said, looking straight at him, "betrayal is when you see something wrong and don't say it. You're saving it, even though the industry probably doesn't want to be saved." Meanwhile, in Meadowville, Evelyn received a strange package. No sender. Inside was a photo album, not of her family, but black and white photos of elderly black women, handcuffed, eyes full of fear. The last page bore a line written in red marker. "Everybody in here didn't believe this could happen to them." Evelyn put her hand on the cover. She didn't cry. She wasn't angry. She was just as still as if the wind had stopped. Then she did something simple. She placed the album on the porch table so that anyone who stopped by could open it and see. "The truth shouldn't be hidden under the floor. It should be where people can touch it," she said. That evening, 3 cars were parked 2 blocks away from Evelyn's house. The lights weren't completely off. They weren't getting out, just waiting. Ryan got word from a kind neighbor and rushed back. When he stepped onto the porch, Evelyn was still sitting there, quiet as ever. "You know they're there?" he asked. "Yes, but they don't understand. This old lady faced down bloodhounds during the civil rights movement. A few parked cars didn't stop her." Ryan sat down next to his mother. The night wind blew up his collar. Cold, but his heart was warm. I don't know how long I can hold out. When the system starts shooting at the fixers, how can I fix it? Evelyn looked up at the sky, where the stars were twinkling in the distance. I didn't fix it myself. I just lit the lamp, and the light spreads itself. Ryan nodded. A small, sad but genuine smile played at the corners of his mouth. The next morning, the police department announced internally that Ryan Monroe would be temporarily transferred to administrative status to serve as an independent investigation. No official reason, no explanation, no charges, but only one step away. Some officers on the force wrote letters of support. Others were silent. But everyone knew this was the beginning of a silent disbarment. Ryan didn't react. He simply folded up his desk, took his name tag off the door, and took it home. That night, Evelyn placed the name tag on the porch table, right next to the brick someone had thrown at the fence. A symbol of resistance, next to a symbol of perseverance. And between them, there was Ryan Monroe, a son, an officer, a light bearer, even as darkness roared in from all sides. There's a strange time after every big confrontation. When the storm has calmed, the buzz has died down. Social media no longer mentions you every minute. When the skeptical eyes retreat behind the door, then there's just you. And the choice. For Ryan Monroe, that time is now. He sits in his makeshift office. No name tag, no classified files, no authority to issue orders. Just an old desk, a fax machine that clatters every hour, and a business card from the federal attorney, quietly left on his desk. The card is an invitation, a way out, a proposal. If you want to quit, we'd love to bring you in as a civil rights supervisor. More pay, more power, and away from Meadowville. Just sign, just give up the porch. That night, Ryan went back to his mother's house. He found Evelyn making tea, a never-ending ritual, as if each sip washed away the fatigue of the day. He handed his mother his card. She read it, folded it, set it aside without saying anything. I'm not sure I can last here much longer, Ryan said. They're not firing me, but they're wearing me down, bit by bit. Evelyn nodded, her eyes never leaving her teacup. You have the right to leave, but if you leave, who will stay? She put down her teacup and looked up at him. Her eyes were no longer as gentle as usual, but bright as moonlight on the edge of the porch. Ryan, you have the right to leave, but make sure you don't leave because you're afraid. I'm not afraid, Mom. I'm tired. Then rest, then stand up. He bowed his head. Something in his chest snapped. Not from weariness, but from truth. That his mother, the woman who had been singled out for sitting quietly on the porch, had never backed down. What excuse did he have for doing that? I think you should turn down this offer? Evelyn was silent. Then she said, I don't dictate your path. I just remind you that between black and white, there's always a gray line where people like you have to walk alone. But if everyone avoids it, it will always be a path no one dares to walk. And I've already started. If I give up halfway, I'll leave that path to those without hearts. The next day, Ryan walked into the Internal Affairs office. In his hand was a request to deny the transfer, along with a new report, a proposal to create an independent internal monitoring unit with direct access to complaints files. He put it on the commander's desk and said, I'm not leaving. I'm not waiting for anyone else to do it. I'm starting in here. The commander looked at him, his eyes a mixture of contempt and admiration. Finally, he let out a soft breath. Good luck, Monroe. They're coming for you. Not with guns, but with isolation, transfer, and suffocation. I know, and I saw it happen to my mother. Back home, Ryan sat next to Evelyn. On the porch, a group of high school students were sitting around her like a fire, listening to stories about the black history that was never taught in textbooks. You were banned from the library, Evelyn said. But I sat in front of the library, waiting for hours, just so they would have to look at me when I came out. And I didn't chant, I just sat, so they couldn't say I wasn't there. A little girl asked, Aren't you scared? Scared. But I'm more scared if I disappear in silence. Ryan listened, and he understood. What his mother had said last night wasn't just advice. It was a legacy, a kind of power that had no guns, no medals, just memories and an indelible presence. You refuse to leave. Ryan said softly. I know, Evelyn smiled. You'll get attacked more, and you'll stand firmer. On the coffee table, the business card now served as a bookmark, sandwiched between the pages of Maya Angelou's book, where it read, Still like dust, I'll rise. Sometimes the hardest thing isn't choosing right or wrong. It's choosing between the right that isolates you and the right that silences you forever. For Ryan Monroe, the days after he turned down the offer to move to senior advisor were suffocatingly quiet. No one openly opposed him. No one stood in his way. But no one knocked on his office door now. The meetings he used to be invited to now took place behind his back. The reports he proposed were sent back with vague notes. Insufficient evidence to act. We need more time to review. Please reconsider your wording. Avoid divisive. Ryan understood. This was how the system punished those who disobeyed. Not with whips, but with icy indifference. And worst of all, he began to doubt himself. One afternoon, Ryan returned to his mother's porch earlier than usual. He had no papers, no phone, just himself, with a heavy heart. Evelyn was pruning some old rose bushes. She said nothing when she saw him, just poured another cup of tea and handed it to him. Remember when you first learned to ride a bike? She asked. Ryan chuckled. You kept falling. And when you fell the third time, you insisted on throwing it in the trash, she said, her eyes still intent on cutting the dead leaves. But what did you say? I said if you don't fall, you'll never learn to get back up properly. Evelyn looked at him. Not gently this time, but as firm as a rock. And now you're falling. Not because you're weak, but because you're taking a path most people avoid. I know you want to change, but I also know you don't believe you can do it. Ryan put down his teacup. Mom, have you ever thought you would fail? Evelyn smiled, a sad smile like the sunset behind the trees. I always think so. But every time I think about giving up, I remember. If I give up, there will be someone like me, sitting somewhere, thinking about giving up too. And if we both give up, who do we leave that path to? That night, Ryan wrote a handwritten letter. No email, no press. He wrote to his former colleagues, people who had fought alongside him, but now avoided his eyes. I am not betraying the profession. I am saving it, as far as my conscience allows. I do not love this job for the power. I love it for the opportunity to protect people like my mother, Evelyn Monroe, who was considered a threat simply because she had stayed where she was for more than 40 years. If you remember why we swear our badges, I invite you to step out of your silence, even if it is just a small step. Sometimes it only takes one step to start a new path. He signed Ryan Monroe, still in office and still here. The next morning, the letter was shared on the intranet. Some took it down. Some quietly forwarded it. Some printed it out and posted it on locker room bulletin boards. No comment, just a sentence added in red ink. I read, and I am here. On the third day after the letter, Ryan got a call from a young officer, Sandra Lynn, an Asian, 2-year veteran, quiet, never speaking up. Ryan, she said over the phone, her voice shaking. Thank you. If you need someone to sit in the next hearing, I'll sit. Ryan paused. He hadn't expected someone like her. But in that moment, he understood. Big changes don't start with crowds. They start with the courage of one person. On the porch, Evelyn pinned a white strip of cloth to the railing, a symbol of peace, of insubordination. A passing student asked, Why didn't you choose black or red? Evelyn replied, stroking the strip of cloth. Because there are things that are not in between light and dark. They are in between. And that's the hardest place to be. But it's also the place where people are needed the most. Autumn came quietly. The leaves on Maple Street turned orange and yellow. The wind blew gently through the porches. On a familiar street corner, Evelyn Monroe's old dark wooden house still stood there, proud as a testament to the most unyielding things in a town that had once turned its back. And she still sat there, the same old wooden chair, the same chipped porcelain teacup, the same frank but gentle eyes. Only now, she was no longer sitting alone. Since Ryan decided to stay, since the day his letter spread, since the day a young officer dared to say, I'm here too, things had not turned to a new chapter right away. But it slowly changed color. People who had been silent began to raise their heads. Those who had avoided Evelyn when passing by now stopped to say hello. Some brought cookies. Some apologized. Some just nodded. But it was the nod of understanding. No words needed. One afternoon, Ryan walked out onto the porch and saw a group of high school students sitting on the steps. A curly-haired girl asked, "Uncle, is that story true?" "My mom said it was on TV, but TV tends to exaggerate things." Ryan didn't answer right away. He looked at his mother. Evelyn smiled and said, "It's true, honey. As true as Grandma sitting here every afternoon. And as true as that day, if Ryan hadn't come, Grandma would have been taken away without anyone knowing." The girl was silent. The group was silent. Then a boy timidly raised his hand and asked, "Then, how do we know when to speak up?" Evelyn tilted her head, her voice soft but clear. "When you see someone being treated as invisible, that's when." At a town meeting in November, the mayor read out a pledge to reform the police force, along with a list of Ryan's approved proposals: an independent oversight board, whistleblower protections, civics education in schools. No applause. No boos, just silence. A special kind of silence. No longer of avoidance, but of recognition. Ryan walked out of the building, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his tie loosened. He walked toward the porch where his mother sat, and the town seemed to freeze in that moment. That house, that chair, that woman, and that son. They didn't need to say anything more. That evening, when the only sound was the wind and the crickets, Ryan said, "I did my best, Mom. I don't know if things have changed much." Evelyn sipped her tea. "No one changes the world in one term, but you made it impossible for it to close its eyes." Ryan smiled softly, but the smile was wet. He bowed his head, holding his mother's hand. "Thank you for not leaving this chair." Evelyn squeezed her hand, still looking out at the road. "Everyone has a place they have to keep. And this is mine. I keep it, so you can walk out of here, with your head down." A month later, a small bronze plaque was attached to the railing of Evelyn's porch. Not from the government, not from the press, but from the community designed by the people themselves. It read, "This porch held the line, and the woman who sat here never moved." They wanted to handcuff a 76-year-old woman, just for sitting quietly on her own porch. We live in a world where race is still a cause for suspicion, where the mere presence of a black person at the wrong address can be construed as suspicious behavior. And the scariest thing of all, those cops didn't see that they were wrong. They walked in with authority on their shoulders, weapons at their sides, and a suspicious look in their eyes that had been built up by decades of prejudice. They didn't ask, "How long have you lived here?" They asked, "What are you doing here?" They didn't see a mother, a grandmother, a peaceful neighbor. They saw danger. And if her son, Ryan Monroe, hadn't arrived in time, would we be watching another arrest video? Will Evelyn Monroe ever be heard of, or will she just be a line in the police report? "Uncooperative lady, taken to station for clarification." The problem here is not just a bad 911 call. It's a system that allows it to happen. If you've ever thought, "What's with racism these days?" think back to the look on the officer's face when he confronted Evelyn. If you've ever thought, "This won't happen to me," imagine your mother, grandmother, or yourself being treated like a stranger in your own home. The truth is, as long as there is silence, it will happen again. Evelyn didn't leave her porch. Ryan didn't leave the industry despite being isolated. What would you do? If this story moves you, if it makes you angry, if you believe people like Evelyn deserve protection and respect, click like to show the world where you stand. Leave a comment to support Evelyn and her son Ryan, who chose to stand up when others chose to stay silent. And most importantly, hit subscribe now, because we will continue to bring you real stories, real struggles, and people like you, like us, who are working to change this world every day. Don't let this story just be a video you scroll past. Turn it into action. A voice, a beginning. Thank you for listening. We will see you on the next journey for truth and justice.